This week, frozen tax thresholds are pulling landlords and families into inheritance tax trap, creating financial challenges for everyone. Now, what are the key points we're going to talk about here? Basically, 600,000 UK landlords are facing inheritance tax bills. That's over 20% of all UK landlords, or approximately 613,000 of the 2.81 million. Basically, it's from frozen allowances, which have been frozen since 2009, I think, and rising property values, which again isn't a bad thing. The accountancy firm RSM estimates 50,000 more landlords will fall into that trap on a yearly basis and every year forward. But what is IHT? What is inheritance tax? It's basically charged at 40% on the portion of your estate that exceeds £325,000. If it's a family home, main residence, then you have an extra £175,000 allowance when it's passed on to your children. Combined allowances are available for spouses, so you've got basically 325 plus 325 plus 175. However, because thresholds have been frozen since 2009 and house prices have gone through the roof, it's meaning that more and more estates are being dragged into this net. Okay, what's the impact on landlords and tenants? More and more people are starting to worry about it. You know, if you've got a house that's the average UK price, 288,000, that's not a great deal. But if you have a portfolio of say 3 or 4, you know, the other 3 or 4 are going to fall into it. However, if landlords control this now and start selling off property, then that's going to have a big effect on the rental supply. So if they're trying to minimise liabilities, it's probably going to drive rents up. I know rents for this year, according to the Zoopla report we talked about last week, you know, are probably going to run about 3% increases. You know, that's not going to continue, and you will see that increasing because, as we know, there's a huge shortage of build out there, and the Labour government are saying themselves that the view from power, as opposed to being in competition in the Parliament, is a lot worse than they thought. So, how many of these properties have been sold? 300,000 buy-to-let houses have been sold since 2016. Okay, why has that occurred? I think certainly changes to legislation, tax hikes are to a large extent to blame, but also an ageing landlord population and financial metrics. You know, it's not as if you've got a HMO, for example, and you're paying twice as much for your electricity or your gas as you were, then it's going to make it less profitable for you. So is it such a great idea? What other things could you do? And also, a lot of landlords bought, when I did, for example, 30 years ago, and they've been managing those portfolios since then. You know, they've just had enough. You know, you get to this stage where you think, well, you know, is it really worth all the hassle? For the long term, it is, because cap appreciation will be great. But what about all the other things that pull you back? And that as a baby boomer has got more and more of a part to play. The October budget to changes to IHT, inheritance tax, mean now even more private pensions are falling into it, and farmers are having a problem. It's a much more draconian tax than it was. And to a certain extent, it goes against rationale. You know, why punish people for making money, which is what they're doing. So ongoing, what does that mean? Number of states paying inheritance tax has doubled from 4 to 8% in the UK. There are many things you can do, like alternatives, like using family trusts or corporate ownership, but this can be a bit problematic if you haven't got a lot of time on your hands to do it, especially for small landlords. Those with a small to medium-sized portfolio are being worst hit. The larger portfolios are not, because they've got time and the money to plan in advance. How can you manage IHT? I was having a chat with my wife earlier on this week about, you know, things we can do. You've got gifts, potentially exempt transfers. You can take out life insurance in trusts. How does that work? Well, I think on a gifting basis, you can give up to £3,000 a year, and that'd be exempt from any tax. You can also give one-off gifts to grandchildren if you have them. PET is a potentially exempt transfer, so you give something away that's greater than that amount of money. You have to live for 7 years to make it tax-free. In the final 3 years, you have a certain amount of tax on it, but it tapers away. So a potentially exempt transfer. Now, life insurance is quite a good one because you can take out that quite cheaply, and as long as you have it in a small trust, that would pay all your inheritance tax. So that's something worthwhile thinking about. The thing that's not well known is if you complete an IHT 400 form, you can actually pay your inheritance tax over 10 years. So you divide it up and pay it on the drip, which is quite a benefit if you do end up with a large inheritance tax bill and perhaps you don't want to sell the house that you've inherited. So that's not so much about landlords, that's more about family homes. So what's the effect of this? 600,000 more landlords falling into the trap in real life? Well, again, according to the Telegraph, they report that over 200,000 families are giving away homes to avoid IHT this year. 220,000 homes will be gifted to children this year, up 45% from last year when it was 152. Parents are gifting homes to reduce the liability. However, there are risks to it. You know, there are strict rules on this. if you do give a house away, you must relinquish it completely. You can't live in it. If you do live in it, you have to pay a proper rent, and HMRC will look at that very clearly. You can, have informal usage, for example, guidelines, which if you go and tend the garden of this house, it could fall back into your estate. It's a bit like the inheritance tax thing, where people say to me, I've moved my domicile away from the UK, and in reality, it can be very easily reassumed domicile, and so you do get done for inheritance tax. And in places like New South Wales and Australia, there's no IHT. In places like Monaco, there's no IHT. So if you get yourself domiciled there, you can therefore avoid IHT in the UK as long as you're no longer domiciled. And how do you know if you're domiciled or not? You never will, because the revenue will not give you a clear guideline in advance. I've met people who said they've got it. I don't believe it. People like super wealthy people like Rocco Forte. He wrote to his accountant in the UK from Monaco saying, I'd like to come home for treatment. And HOME cost him £20 million. So £5 million a letter, because that's what he did him for on IHT. I think there is a story also, if I drag my mind back, on Richard Burton. He died with a Welsh flag on his grave. Oh no, he had a Welsh flag put on his grave, and apparently that re-established domicile. I don't know if that's true or not, who knows. So what should landlords be worried about and if they do gift away their properties and the 7-year rule applies? Capital gains tax, gifting usually triggers CGT on the market value, okay? But if it's a family home, it is exempt. But if it's an investment, if it's a buy-to-let, it won't be. Retirement risks. Experts are cautioning that gifting too much could leave individuals unable to support themselves later in life. And that's a truth. If you look at what inflation has done over the last year, or the last 10 years, your value of your money has been eroded away, and you wouldn't want it to end up, 85, 90 years old, and suddenly find you haven't got enough to live on. What are the driving factors behind it? It's as we covered in the first part of this. It's really capital gains tax rates, inheritance tax rates are being changed by Labour, so it's going up, and it's going up to a large extent because house prices are going up more, and it will go up further. So it's basically the government's policy is fueling this inheritance tax concern and this trap a lot of people are falling into. But proper planning prevents poor performance. If you plan now, use trusts, insurances, potentially exempt transfers, those sort of things, it can be got around. If you own a company, you have 4 different share types in a company, an SPV, you can change those share types to ownership ones for your children, and you can have the income ones. So it can be dealt with in that way. So just do the planning before you go out and buy stuff or even go to sell stuff. That's it for really on that sort of topic for this week. I hope you found that useful. Some questions for the last few weeks. As the saying goes, what goes up must come down. If they keep going up, when it crashes, it will be bigger than we've ever seen. A ticket won't be long now, 5, 5, 6, 7. We're talking about property prices there. But why? Why are we going to have this humongous crash? We've already seen there's a huge shortage. Okay, there might be a flattening effect. You might have a short-term lack of progress, like in London we've had very little upward progress for the last 8 or 9 years. But a crash, I don't think that's likely. Okay, so won't be long now, 5, 5, 6, 7, I don't buy that. John Gotti, I think John Gotti was the godfather of some nature in New York, was he not? So he's commenting this week. He's saying he's very wary of Chairman Keir's ambivalent attitude towards landlords. There is sight to make it illegal to let a property from with an EPC less than C. Well, yes, if you have an EPC less than C, when the EPC certification comes in, you will not be able to rent your property out, which is why buying the correct property that has an EPC of C or above is an important thing. But as John Gotti says, from his cell probably in New York, there's no issue for large multinationals that own large blocks. It's true, but build to rent has not got that problem. And that's why build to rent is such a huge thing in the US and in Europe, and will become so in the UK. Finally, Stephen Morris, bless him, tenant rights are through the roof. That's not so bad. If you're a good landlord, it doesn't matter. If you've got a good quality product, if tenants' rights are through the roof, you'll get good tenants who will respect you and respect your property. Buy the right sort of property and you get the right sort of tenant. That's what we always say at APW. So there we go. That's it for the week. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed that. Do have a good Christmas, and we'll speak after that. Cheerio.